the top scientists in the West apparently atheist. I'm not just thinking about Richard Dawkins here, who is obviously a notorious atheist, but there's a very substantial atheism, it seems, present in the Western scientific community, which always struck me as slightly odd. But is there a sociological explanation or some other explanation that we can help to unravel that mystery?
Yeah, of course. I think there are a few things. I think on a fundamental level, humility is not a virtue that comes easily to those who are more intelligent than the majority of people around them. Human beings are predisposed to pride in many forms, but intellectual pride is can be very difficult to diagnose and can hide very well. But essentially, once you start to see as a scientist how capable you are of describing and discovering new phenomena about the universe, you perhaps it becomes harder for you to admit that there are things that you cannot describe, that you cannot quantify, that you cannot measure. It's fundamental. It feels almost insulting to admit that to yourself, that, okay, I can't measure the soul, therefore it's better for me to say the soul doesn't exist than to have some element of humility and say, okay, perhaps there's a sphere in which my skills, my intellect are capable of comprehending things. And then there's something outside of that isn't within that. And I have to be honest with myself and be able to say, okay, here are my limitations. That's one thing I've seen. Another thing is...
very helpful what you just said, but at the very end there, you just let that's what you have seen. So this is something you actually witnessed at Oxford University without going too parochial. It's an observation of yours rather than just a theoretical reflection. You've noticed this issue being right.
Well, Paul, I must say it's not something I've seen just in people around me. I, for a long time, was you could almost have called me an agnostic, and I know you have a widespread audience, so my honesty is not to shock people. It's more to say that there are doubts and periods in your life which you go through, and these are observations I made about myself as well when I came back to the religion that I was born into. I would say outwardly I never really stopped appearing like a Muslim. I wasn't in clubs or doing some of those other things, but my internal consolidation of my faith wasn't quite there. They say the belief in the unseen, as referred to in the Quran, I didn't have that at the time.
Right, interesting.
But sorry, that's a side point. It's not just I observe these things.
With respect, it's not a side point. I think it's really interesting what you're saying, because obviously, to do a PhD in physics at Oxford, you've got to have a pretty high IQ, to put it. So you are one of these people who potentially might be arrogant, full of hubris. Obviously, you're not. Looking at you, you're not such a person at all. But the temptation was there for certain kinds of people, and you are one of those certain kinds of people, clearly. And so it's fascinating you wrestled with this, and you came back to faith and belief in the unseen, and as a Muslim. And were there any issues in that transition back to faith that are relevant to our discussion, do you think?
Yeah, and I think we will touch upon them, but I want to first perhaps finish addressing your question about why I think so many scientists in the West are atheist.
Thank you.
I think it's also, again, like I said, it's statistically more people now are atheists, and therefore more scientists are also atheists.
Yes.
So, it's also that trend we see in society. And like I said, we do science without the philosophy of science. And so for a while we had science, I think, as the real gold standard of what people should believe in, scientism, as it's referred to by famous philosophers like Thomas Nagel. But actually now I think we have ideology trumping science.
Interesting.
So science actually now is giving way to what people simply want to believe in. And an observation I've made within myself and other people is that often we choose our positions and then justify them to ourselves afterwards.
Yes.
And science is not immune from this. And I don't want to speak specifically about certain things, but you've spoken about them on your channel previously. That it doesn't matter what argument you give to someone, and this is kind of Quranic as well, even if you show them a miracle, if they are deaf and blind to receiving that truth, whether it be scientific, religious, or otherwise, human beings are fascinating in that they really won't move from their position, even if somewhere they know they're wrong. They simply don't want to be.
Yes,
they
simply don't want to myself and in others as well. It seems to be very characteristic. Yeah.
Right. We have this kind of ego that attaches itself to an idea, and then the idea trumps everything else. And science is also giving way in the modern world to ideology. It's no longer this kind of bastion of great, knowledge that everyone subscribes to. No, it's kind of now, this is what we feel like doing, and let's see if science backs us up. But if it doesn't, then science can also go away. So
the idea that science traditionally is a fearless endeavor to objectively look for the truth, whatever the cost, we will just go where the evidence leads. You're saying is becoming a casualty to certain ideologies, which we've not named, because we're being diplomatic, but one just simply needs to open a newspaper and it's all there. Just to give clarity what we're talking about. But you're right. There are certain things which seem to be based on science, which are now just ignored. Even perhaps you're saying by scientists, perhaps in the name of this ideology, which is now ascendant in the West.
Exactly.